Great painters and great poets have this amazing gift of being able to transport their audience to a different place in time, away from the current chaos of our reality, away from the pain of everyday life, and into a place of beauty, peace, and rest. Terry Redlin, Thomas Kincaid, Norman Rockwell were master painters that had this great ability, and they were famous for being able to transport the mind of their viewer to a place of peace and beauty and even love, to a simpler place, a place where there was not a care in the world, a place that we all probably think of as home in our hearts. Robert Frost, the poet, had that same ability, and one of his most famous poems was entitled, "Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening." Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near, between the woods and frozen lake on the darkest evening of the year. He gives his harness bells a shake to ask, is there some mistake? The only other sound, the sweep of wind and downy flake. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. As a young boy in the Midwest, I've spent many winter days and even evenings in a snowy woods. And I can relate to that poem because those kinds of experiences are experiences that I'll never forget. Being in a dark woods at night when the only sound you hear is the sound of giant snowflakes falling. But even if you've never lived in a snow-covered landscape, listening to a poem like that brings you to a place of peace, doesn't it? A place of rest, a place of joy, an ideal place that I suspect on some level we all long for from time to time. It takes us back to our idea of home. And that, in a nutshell, is what the Feast of Tabernacles is all about. So join me today as we meet Jesus in the Feast of Tabernacles. The Feast of Tabernacles was essentially a feast to remind Israel not only of paradise past, but of paradise even yet to come. It was a time when Israel was to celebrate the glory of her God that she would one day enjoy, as she had, in effect, in the Garden of Eden. Back in the Garden of Eden, before sin entered the world, heaven and earth were not two separate places, but they were really just two different parts of the same creation. Heaven and earth were really united in the Garden of Eden because there God and man dwelt together in perfect paradise and harmony. And the Feast of Tabernacles was really a celebration of returning to that paradise that was lost in the Garden of Eden. It was a celebration of not just paradise past, but the paradise that was promised to come. It was a celebration of that existence that only belongs to the people of God. It was a celebration of Israel coming home to her God someday. In the Feast of Tabernacles, Israel spent an entire week living and celebrating the blessings of God. This was now at the very end of the harvest season. All the crops were in. All the grain bins were full. All the wine vats were full. It was a celebration of the bounty of God that He had given them. Not only that, but if you remember from last week, Israel has just endured the drama of the Day of Atonement, the uncertainty of God's wrath or God's blessing. And at the end of the Day of Atonement, God blessed His people by atoning for their sins. And so all of that made this just a grand celebration, a season of expectation, but a season of relaxation and peace. Remember, the harvest season's over. Life slows down. And life is just enjoyed by the people of the feast. The entire theme of this peace is one of rejoicing and joy in the blessings of God. This was one of the 3 festivals that the men of Israel were required to go to Jerusalem to celebrate. Not the families, but at least the men were required to go to Jerusalem. Most of the time, families went along. Jerusalem was more crowded on this celebration than any other celebration of the year, including Passover. And more animals were sacrificed during the Feast of Tabernacles than any other feast. In fact, in one Old Testament passage in 1 Kings, it says that so many animals were sacrificed during the Feast of Tabernacles that they couldn't even be counted. And music, while always important in Jewish rituals and ceremonies, was prominent during this time. There were choirs, there were orchestras, there was dancing. The Jewish Mishnah says that anyone who has not witnessed the rejoicing of the Feast of Tabernacles has never even seen rejoicing. This was a Thanksgiving celebration on steroids. It was a party of all parties, to be sure, because God's favor rested upon the people. And Jesus used the events of this celebration to deliver some of his most profound teachings. The Feast of Tabernacles has several names. It's called the Feast of Tabernacles, the Feast of Booths. The Jewish people refer to it as Sukkot. It's also referred to as the Feast of Ingathering, and the priests always referred to it as the season of our joy. But regardless of the name of the feast, it was always separated the same. On the beginning of the feast and on the end of the feast, the Israelites were required to have a day of Sabbath. And it was celebrated at the beginning and at the end by a time of worship. But in between, they were to build booths made of sticks in which to live for the entire week. They were made primarily of willow branches and palm fronds, and they were built as a temporary shelter, but not a perfect shelter. For example, the ceiling in the booth had to be left open so that the people who were celebrating could see the stars at night. These temporary dwellings were a reminder to Israel of what she had experienced while traveling in the desert. But even more than that, they were a reminder that she had been living in booths in the desert, and now she was living in a land flowing with milk and honey, all because of the blessing of her God. And Israel understood that as good as this week was, the best was yet to come. This was but a shadow of what God was preparing for the people of Israel. But just building the booth wasn't enough. Jewish tradition required that the booth be lavishly decorated, often wildly decorated. Each household, as part of the feast, would come out with their best creativity to decorate their own booth. Children were involved in the decorating of the booth. And as part of the feast, people would go from booth to booth, visiting with their neighbors, admiring the decorations that their neighbors had, enjoying food with their neighbors. Even the children would run around and go from house to house, pretty much unsupervised during this time. It was very much like what we do at Christmas time, admiring each other's decorations. And the atmosphere at this time was completely relaxed and joyful. There were no cares because there was no harvest. It was all done. People were enjoying the blessings of God. It was kind of a scene like Norman Rockwell would have painted if he were a first century Jew. That was the Feast of Tabernacles. And the book of Numbers describes the sacrifices that were required during this feast, and they were almost endless. During the week, 70 bulls were offered, 14 rams, 98 lambs, 336 tenths of ephahs of flour. And besides the large number of sacrifices, here's what is so amazing. This feast was the 7th feast of the year. It was held in the 7th month of the year. It was 7 days long. And every single sacrifice that was required was in a multiple of 7. It was by God's design that his perfect seal of approval rested on this particular festival, because the number 7 represents God's perfect number. It was God's intent that this festival would remind the people of Israel of what he was planning for them in the future. It represented his promise to his people of the best yet to come. Now, you would think that of all the festivals, this is one Israel would have celebrated. But in reality, they didn't. They didn't. In fact, in the Old Testament, there's only 2 instances of it happening. The first we read in Nehemiah chapter 8, where we read that the whole company that had returned from the exile built booths and lived in them. From the days of Joshua son of Nun until that day, the Israelites had not celebrated it. Imagine that. Once they come into the land of God's promise, they did not celebrate this feast as instructed by God, with one exception. In 1 Kings, we read the story of Solomon dedicating the temple that he had built for God. And he chose this festival as the time to dedicate that temple. So if you look at Israel's Old Testament history, the only 2 times that this festival was celebrated were watershed events for Israel, high points in Israel's history: the dedicating of the temple and the return from exile. Other than that, in the Old Testament, they did not celebrate this festival. Now, things changed by the time we come to the time of Jesus. In the first century, this thing had morphed into a festival that focused on little wooden booths to a time of immense celebration. By the time of Jesus, it was not only celebrated annually, it was celebrated wildly. This was not just a simple feast in Jesus' day. This was a combination of our Christmas season and Super Bowl Sunday to the people of Israel. Now, there were a few ceremonies in this particular week that accented this time of worship, this time of celebration, and this time of longing. The first was a ceremony that was referred to as the ceremony of the water drawing. And while the ceremony was done at the start of the wet season in Israel, it was done as a reminder for the people of Israel that it was God who poured out rain on the land. What it really celebrated was the coming Holy Spirit, because Israel recognized that rain and water in general represented the pouring out of the Holy Spirit on the people of Israel. They would quote passages like Joel 2, "And afterward I will pour out my Spirit on all people. Your sons and daughters will prophesy, your old men will dream dreams, your young men will see visions." They also quoted passages like Isaiah 12, "With joy you will draw water from the wells of salvation." You see, the water ceremony was a celebration of the coming Holy Spirit, whom God would one day pour out on his people Israel. And here's how the ceremony went. A specially appointed priest would lead a procession out of the temple. He would come out this door right here, which was called the Water Gate. And you thought Watergate was just in Washington, D.C., huh? This gate right here was called the Water Gate because it was out of this gate that the specially appointed priest would lead a procession of people. Hundreds, maybe thousands of people would follow him. Not only that, but he was accompanied by a whole host of people playing the flute. So we have this musical procession that leaves the temple and goes down to the pool of Siloam. There the priest gathers up in this giant wooden vase water from the pool. And he now returns to the temple